think we are ready to start. Okay, welcome everyone to ICCT's live briefing on cashing in on guns, in which we explore the nexus between small arms, light weapons, and terrorist financing. My name is Tanya Mehra, and I'm a senior research fellow at ICCT, as well as the project lead of this research. For those of you who are new, just a few words about ICCT. We are a think tank in the field of CT and countering and violent extremism. We conduct evidence-based research. We provide policy advice to a range of stakeholders. We contribute to the development of good practices at international and at regional level. And we translate our findings into practical workshops, seminars, and publications. Currently, we are also restructuring our work at ICCT along three pillars. The first pillar is current and emerging trends. The second pillar is rule of law responses to terrorism. And the third pillar is CPVE approaches and rehabilitation and reintegration. I ask all of you, if you want to know a little bit more about our pillars, keep an eye on our website. In the coming few weeks, we will provide you with more information about our restructuring along these three pillars. So today we are here to share our findings of our one-year research on cashing in on guns. And this research is part of Project Craft, which is being led by RUSI. And I'm very pleased that all the researchers are here with me today who have contributed to this research. So in order to get a better understanding whether terrorists use small arms and light weapons as a source of terrorist financing, it is important to develop a baseline. So according to the UN Security Council, over 1 billion weapons are in circulation worldwide, and out of which only 16% are in the hands of security and defense forces. So clearly, small arms and light weapons poses a threat to security, but it also fuels conflicts. And in the long term, it also creates problems regarding sustainable development and economic development. We have focused our research along three questions. So what kind of small arms and light weapons do terrorists possess? How do terrorists acquire small arms and light weapons? And finally, how do terrorists use small arms and light weapons to finance their activities? So if you look back in the last couple of years, the use of small arms and light weapons by terrorists is often associated with terrorist attacks. In the West, a series of deadly attacks have been carried out with guns in Brussels, in Paris, but also in Orlando. It is therefore understandable that the focus has been on preventing terrorists from acquiring weapons. But we wanted to explore how terrorists can use small arms and light weapons in other ways. For example, by being directly involved in trafficking or indirectly involved in trafficking by riding shotgun or providing protection to actual traffickers. So we also will look at the differences between the direct financing, so the cashing in on sales of guns, and indirect financing, such as racketeering, extortion, kidnapping for ransom. So these are the areas we have researched in the last year. And before I would like to introduce to you our panel, I just want to say a few housekeeping rules. So after the presentation, there's a short Q&A. So feel free to ask any questions you have anytime through the chat function. And a recording of this webinar will also be available at our YouTube channel for those who have registered. And finally, at the end, we would appreciate it if you would fill in a short survey on how we are conducting these kind of live briefings. So now I would like to introduce to you to our dream team. First of all, Méryl Demuynck, she's a junior researcher at ICCT, and her research focuses on Western Africa. Then we will proceed with Dr. Colin Clarke. He's a director of research and policy at the Soufan group, as well as an associate at ICCT, and his research focus on the Middle East. I will then briefly discuss the DDR, the suitability of DDR, and hand over to Dr. Nils Duquet, and he's the director of the Flemish Peace Institute in Belgium, and he will discuss the short and long-term consequences for Europe of our research. So I would now like to give the floor to my colleague, Méryl. Méryl, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you all for joining this live briefing today. I will indeed be discussing our main research findings for West Africa. But before that, I would just like to give a few words on the regional context. Next slide, please. And first of all, on the level of terrorist threat across the region. West Africa has seen surge in terrorist violence in recent years. It has both intensified and spread throughout the sub-region, especially throughout the Sahel and the tri-border area between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, where both the Al-Qaeda-affiliated Jenim and the ISGS, the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, operate, but also throughout the Lake Chad Basin, and especially Nigeria, which has been confronted with the presence of Boko Haram, the Islamic State West Africa province, ISWAP, and its offshoot groups. Nigeria, Mali, and Burkina Faso were all ranked amongst the countries worst affected by terrorist casualties in 2019, and the Sahel in particular has seen the most dramatic increase in terrorist violence on the continent, with a 7-fold increase in the number of attacks that have been carried out in this area between mid-2017 and mid-2020. Also important to note for this research is the important concentration of small arms and live weapons throughout the region. West Africa is the African sub-region that concentrates the highest number of civilian-held firearms on the continent, approximately 11 million. But perhaps even more striking than the number itself is to see that the vast majority of all firearms available, around 90%, are actually in the hands of civilians, which can be people, individuals in search of protection and security, bandits, various criminals, but also violent extremist actors. So with that context in mind, our first objective was to look at the types of small arms and live weapons that terrorist groups possess and use in the region. Next slide, please. And in order to do that, we looked at the different types of arms that are known to be circulating throughout the region in order to assess which one formed the bulk of these groups' armament. And based on both the data that conflict armament research shared with us, as well as some data that we collected ourselves through interviews with various experts, it clearly appeared that the bulk of their armament is made of industrial, military types of small arms and light weapons. Especially AK pattern assault rifles really stood out as the most common weapon used by violent extremist actors in the region. We also looked at other types, such as craft-produced firearms. But while the small-scale production of weapons in the region is a widespread practice, it doesn't seem to be a primary source for terrorist groups. It could at most represent either second best option in case of shortage of arms, or an entry-level type of equipment for aspiring militants that do not benefit yet from the right connections or the right networks to be able to acquire more sophisticated arms. The only exception to this limited use of artisanal weapons is the increasing use of improvised explosive devices. It has been described by most interviewees as being the main, if not the only real evolution in terms of these groups' armament in recent years. And finally, we also looked at converted firearms. Their presence in the region was confirmed by many experts, but they also underlined the fact that very few of them are actually converted into lethal weapons, and also that there is very few evidence showing that terrorist groups use this kind of firearms for two main reasons. First, because they do not allow to conduct large-scale operations, but also due to the widespread availability of real weaponry throughout the region. Overall, there are also two main elements that came out from this research. First of all, we could not observe any major difference between the various groups that are active in West Africa. And more importantly, this equipment that terrorist groups use fairly reflects what domestic security and defense forces also use. And that can be largely explained by looking at terrorist groups' procurement strategies. Next slide, please. So through this research, we were able to identify four main types of acquisition methods or supply sources. The first one being legacies of past conflicts, which refers to arms and ammunition that have continued to recirculate throughout the region following wars, including wars in Liberia, Sierra Leone, or Côte d'Ivoire. Despite efforts that have often been implemented to avoid this phenomenon, such as DDR programs, for instance, it seems that this armament continues to fuel black markets, illicit flows going on in West Africa, and non-state armed actors. Excuse me. Terrorist groups also have been able to procure weapons following the collapse of state control over arsenals. It seems that a large share of their armament originate from post-Gaddafi Libya, as well as from Malian stocks that were looted in northern regions following the breakout of the 2012 crisis. And even as some of these flows seems to have decreased, such as the outflows from Libya, which have believed to have reduced or even reversed from 2014 onwards, because of the increasing domestic demand in Libya, terrorist groups have been able to maintain steady supply and to continue grow their arsenals, mainly based on battlefield capture. They have been able to loot great quantities of weapons following or during attacks on security and defense forces positions, which have been among their primary targets in the region. And finally, even if that seems to be a marginal source compared to the three first sources, corruption is still believed to have at least facilitated the access to small arms and light weapons to non-state armed groups, with some elements within the security and military personnel either stealing or selling their own equipment to non-state actors. So all of these sources, of course, in turn fuel illicit flows in the region. But what these findings really tell us is that small arms and light weapons that are currently used by violent extremist actors in the region actually originate from either West African or neighboring countries' national stockpiles. And this armament was acquired through past or more recent diversions. This, of course, raises a number of challenges at the tactical, operational level, but more broadly, it also questions the security of continuing to export small arms and light weapons to these countries, knowing that they could very rapidly fall into the wrong hands. And this is even more concerning if you consider the role that small arms and light weapons play within terrorist groups' broader strategies, including their financing strategies. Next slide, please. So looking at these linkages between small arms and light weapons and terrorist financing was, of course, at the core of this research project. And in order to do that, we mainly examined two possible avenues through which terrorist groups can get advantage of these arms to earn income. The first one is direct financing through small arms and light weapons, which refers to the funds and proceeds that terrorist groups can get from their involvement in arms trafficking. On that aspect, it seems that evidence that would point out to a structural direct involvement of terrorist groups in trafficking, benefiting from the sale of arms, is rather limited. Some interviewees referred to instances where terrorist groups might have played the role of arms suppliers, mainly to buy loyalties or to provide support to smaller cells or affiliated groups. But even in those cases, it remained quite uncertain whether these transfers generated any income or if they were rather used as a way to grow or to strengthen the group's network. Overall, what came out from the interviews as well is that there seems to be little incentives for terrorist groups to use these arms and weapons as commodities to sell and make profit of. First, because they are very critical operational means, but also because arms trafficking requires certain logistics, human resources. It generates both costs and risk that terrorist groups may not always be willing to take, especially given the immediate availability of weapons in the areas where they are conducting operations. On the contrary, small arms and light weapons really appeared as a strategic tool enabling terrorist groups to establish and maintain their control over territories and people, and enabling them to conduct various criminal income-generating activities. And in West Africa, these activities can include kidnappings of both Westerners and locals for ransom. It can include robberies and theft, especially of livestock, for instance. It also allows these groups to conduct raids on villages, to extort local population through the collection of various taxes, like the zakat in the Sahel, for instance. It may also enable these groups to indirectly benefit from different types of illicit flows in arms, but also in drugs, migrants, contraband, for instance, enabling them to collect taxation, protection fees on the convoys that go through areas under their control. And finally, another element that quite often came out from the interviews was artisanal gold mining, which seems to have provided terrorist groups with a new opportunity and a new target for their operations and extortion operations. So what this research really shows us is that small arms and light weapons should not be merely seen as operational tools that are only used to perpetrate attacks, but rather that small arms and light weapons acquisition by violent extremist actors serves as an enabling crime. And that further underscores the need for various practitioners, local and international stakeholders, to look at this phenomenon and identify and try to address the use of small arms and light weapons as a source of terrorist funding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Méryl, for sharing the research findings on West Africa. I would like to also encourage all the participants who would like to ask a question to post it in the Q&A as well. And I would now like to hand the floor to Dr. Colin Clarke. Colin, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Tanya. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we
Great.
can.
I'd like to thank ICCT, The Hague, for the opportunity to work on this project, to Tanya for her project leadership, to Méryl, Nils, to Cameron Lumley from the University of Pittsburgh for his research assistance, and to everyone that helped on these efforts. You know, the best part about research, at least for me, the most exciting part, and I'm probably going to sound like a bit of a nerd here, but it's that, we don't know what we're going to find when we begin the process. We have hypotheses, we collect data, we analyze the data within our analytic framework. And, I was expecting to find more evidence in the Middle East of direct financing, and that's not what I found. But I'll get into that over the course of these slides. Next slide, please. Unsurprisingly to most that follow the Middle East, this is a region that has experienced significant levels of conflict. And as such, there's really a supply and demand driving to the region. We can look at Syria, Iraq, Yemen, or we can go back historically and look at the Iran-Iraq War in 1980 to 1988, the Lebanese Civil War, 1975 to 1990, all of the 2003 invasion of Iraq and what followed that. So there's all these major events happening in the region that is driving the demand signal for the acquisition of small arms and light weapons by terrorist groups, and I would say other violent non-state actors as well. We basically found several types of small arms and light weapons in the region: assault rifles, handguns, rocket launchers. And as Méryl mentioned earlier, and we had great access to CAR, Conflict Armament Research, and they've been extremely generous with their time and in both interviews, but also in sharing data. And one of the things that stuck out was 91% of the arms in the region were considered small arms that CAR found. So I thought that was a pretty significant finding. And then, we have a number of drivers, and these are explored throughout the chapter. Really, these are major issues in and of themselves. So during this briefing, I won't give them the justice that they deserve, but I do urge you to go back and read the chapter because there's a lot of robust research that's underpinning these different sections. So we've got the importance of state-sponsored diversion, and Méryl alluded to that as well in her findings. The fact that we've been dealing with the Islamic State, its diversified sources of weapons. The fact that ISIS in many ways embodied the previous slide, thank you, the crime terror nexus, and I'll talk a little bit about that shortly as well. The Syrian civil war and all of the different groups that have been active there from the beginning of that conflict. We recently hit the 10-year anniversary, and there's been all sorts of external players in that conflict, and we know who they are: Iran, Russia, the Gulf states, Turkey, the United States at various points, et cetera. So a lot of different kind of shifting alliances and proxies that have driven the demand signal there as well for weapons. Yemen, similar case. What's happening in the Arabian Peninsula turned into something of a proxy conflict, and you've got various actors in Yemen, both the ones that we know well, like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or the Houthi rebels, but also kind of smaller criminal networks that were at play there. And that was something that came up in the interviews quite a bit. And then North Africa, right, as a conduit to the Middle East. A lot of times when we talk about the Middle East, we're saying MENA, right, MENA. We're also talking about North Africa because of the ways that they're inextricably linked. And I think Méryl gave a nice snapshot of what's been happening in Libya. We've seen that Libya has been a source and now a destination, right? And so it's been a dynamic situation there, porous borders and longstanding smuggling routes. Next slide, please. Most of the evidence that we gathered suggests that small arms and light weapons play a much more significant role in the indirect sourcing of terrorist finance. Again, I mentioned when we opened that we didn't know what we would find here, and I thought we would find more evidence of direct financing, and that wasn't the case. The crime terror nexus is another interesting thing to consider. This is an enduring issue, right? When we talk about the crime terror nexus, a lot of people might have the image of foreign fighters from Europe and ISIS. And there's been a lot of great research over the last several years talking about foreign fighters and the crime terror nexus in Europe, in the West, et cetera. There's any number of great researchers that I could reference that have worked on this, Peter Neumann and Magnus Ranstorp and many others who have done research in this area. But this crime terror nexus predates ISIS, and there are these really long-standing sources of smuggling routes in the region. So because of the history of conflict, we've got well-tread traditional smuggling routes, cross-border smuggling, and that's been routine practice for decades, frankly, and it's facilitated a lot of the provision of small arms and light weapons in the region. But I think for me, really, if you're going to take one thing away from this talk, at least when we're talking about the Middle East, it's how influential the indirect financing of small arms and light weapons is. It's almost in a way more insidious than direct financing, because it touches upon all of these other areas, right? Because without small arms, you're unable to do all of these other things, which allow terrorist groups, at least the most successful ones, to have a diversified financial portfolio, whether it's the Islamic State, Hezbollah, or other groups, because they allow you to engage in kidnapping for a ransom, extortion, and taxation, right? Because it's that coercive aspect that enable a lot of these mafia-like tactics, smuggling and trafficking. And again, that's a kind of broad basket there. Smuggling and trafficking are the activities themselves, but what's being smuggled and trafficked? Well, it's been oil, it's been migrants, it's been drugs, in some cases it's been antiquities. And Tanya alluded to in her opening remarks, riding shotgun, right? That's kind of providing armed protection to some of these smuggling caravans as they traverse the region, as they weave in and out of different seams in among borders and border crossings, and traversing different parts of where we see these kind of demand signals coming from. Next slide, please. And again, so to hammer this point home, these groups wouldn't be able to make as much money as they do. And again, I've written a lot about the Islamic State and a lot about ISIS finances, so it's a case I know kind of inside and out. But you think about the scale of extortion that ISIS engaged in, almost industrial scale extortion, where that was such a major pillar of the money they were making. But it was also all these other areas, again, enabled by small arms, and to a lesser extent, light weapons. There was a really great quote that we got from one of the subject matter experts that we interviewed about this notion of direct involvement in trafficking. And that individual said, "We don't see a lot of it, but just because you can't find it doesn't mean that it isn't happening," and it very much is. And that's part of the challenge we have as researchers. We were particularly challenged this past year to get in the field due to COVID. Even folks that have been on the ground have been somewhat limited in their access. And so I think, we've been forced to be more creative in how we kind of get at this. But it's one of those things that's we all kind of sense is happening. We're struggling to find the data and the empirical evidence to prove it, frankly. Where we do see it is, again, the indirect involvement. It's part of a secondary source, and all of these other pillars are enabled through small arms and light weapons. In closing, I would just say, what comes next as we think about areas for further research? And it's a very dynamic situation. I mean, Méryl alluded to what happened in Libya, right? And the kind of inflection point there from 2014 and beyond. It's part of our challenge as analysts, right? To kind of question assumptions and to get at those issues that are not necessarily static. And I think that's certainly the case in the Middle East. So where could we be going in the future? Could digital platforms play a role in this trade? What about 3D printing of weaponry or weapons parts? New conflicts that emerge and current conflicts that are solved, right? So geopolitics always impacts the flow or the illicit flow of weapons So that's something else that's going to change the nature of small arms and light weapons in the region. So I think I'll wrap up there and I'll hand it back to Tanya, but very much look forward to your questions and Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin, for sharing your insights on the chapter on the Middle East. So like an interlude before I will be handing the floor to our last respondent, I just wanted to share a few more thoughts. So the findings of our report illustrate how terrorist groups cash in on guns, and which not only prolongs the conflicts, but also undermines efforts to prevent the spread of violent extremism. So considering that both in West Africa and in the Middle East, there is a proliferation of non-state armed groups, including terrorist groups involved in conflict, we decided to zoom in on peace operation efforts and consider the suitability of DDR programs to disarm terrorists and to stem the flow of small arms and light weapons. Disarmament, security, and development are all linked. And I would like to recall the Sustainable Development Goal number 16, in particular, target number 16.4, which specifically addresses the aim to reduce the flow of arms by 2030. So DDR, together with security sector reform, transitional justice, and arms control are all part of wide peace building efforts. And the D for disarmament is not just about disarmament combatants, but it includes the development of responsible weapon management. And DDR is considered an important tool, but how effective is DDR to reduce the proliferation of weapons in the context of today's conflicts, which often involve non-state armed groups, and in particular designated terrorist groups? So what you've seen is over the years that the DDR programs have evolved and they've adapted to the changing nature of warfare. The first generation of DDR programs were more focused on the individual combatants, whereas the second generation DDR programs focus more on the community and also have community reduction violence programs. So the third generation DDR programs operate in fragile contexts with lack of rule of law and weak government, and often even during a conflict. And there are examples that transitional centers have been set up for ex-combatants, for example, of Al-Shabaab. Next slide, please. But there's still many challenges in the context in which we conducted the research. So designated terrorists cannot be signatories to peace agreements, and terrorist groups oppose the government and don't trust the government, which make it very difficult since DDR programs are voluntary and are based on trust. And DDR programs do not take the political considerations or motivations of terrorist groups into account. And furthermore, I think one of the biggest challenges is whether it successfully can actually address the violent extremist ideologies among the combatants, and it can actually reduce the flow of arms. So several of the interviewees have given examples of how DDR programs in, for example, Sierra Leone and in Liberia have actually created a demand for small arms and light weapons. So weapons become a means to enter into a DDR program so they can benefit from certain financial rewards or other programs that are being offered. Next slide, please. But we also see opportunities, in particular the shift that is taking place from traditional weapon management to transitional weapon management. So traditional weapon management is part of a DDR program and a peace agreement, and it provides oversight and accountability and management of weapons, including on stockpiling, tracing, and transfer of weapons. But when we look at transitional weapon management, it offers interim measures. There is no need for a formal peace agreement. The conflict can still be going on, and it can even be, measures can be concluded even when there is not a central authority. So this basically allows to engage with terrorists, and one could engage in discussions on registering weapons or conducting an arms survey. It also helps to build trust, and it can also help to store weapons. And there have been a few examples in Libya, for example, where discussions have been going on also with terrorist groups to look and discuss with them whether they would really need to use all those weapons which they have, and whether it might be more useful to leave certain more heavier weapons and store them. It isn't obviously a full weapon management system, but it offers an opportunity to engage with these terrorist organizations. So whether DDR is effective or suitable as a tool to reduce the arms flow by terrorists is doubtful. As it is, measuring DDR is not easy. There are multiple aims and multiple metrics. But effective weapon management, especially in conflict and in post-conflict settings, could be a more effective tool to manage and reduce the flow of small arms and light weapons by terrorist groups. The use of transitional weapon management appears to yield some positive results, and this is an area which could be further explored. I would now like to give the floor to Nils Duquet, who will focus on the consequences, long-term and short-term consequences for Europe of the research which we have conducted. I'll give the floor to you, Nils.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you everybody at ICCT for providing me with the floor here and for having me contribute to this very interesting project. So my name is Nils Duquet. I'm the director of the Flemish Peace Institute, which is a research institute affiliated to the Flemish Parliament in Belgium. And me and my colleagues have been doing research on various aspects related to illicit firearms trafficking within the EU, but also gun violence, terrorist access to weapons in Europe, but also arms export controls and illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons outside of Europe. I'm going to talk today specifically about the consequences for Europe based on the findings of this research report. And I think it's important to stress that preventing and combating the direct and indirect use of small arms and light weapons for terrorist financing, both in Middle East as well as in West Africa, is crucial for peace and stability in these regions. Very specifically, but also more general, I think it's an issue of illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons that really causes problems. And we know that this illicit proliferation of these weapons has a conflict igniting effect, since easy access to these weapons, which are generally easy to use, facilitate the possibility of carrying out terrorist attacks and engaging in armed combat. But the proliferation of such weapons not only contributes to the outbreak of armed conflict, but also tends to intensify and to sustain existing armed conflicts and violence. And not only during conflicts, but even after the end of these conflicts, the continued presence of these weapons in post-conflict situations also threatens this often very fragile situation on the ground by increasing the risk of returning back to conflict and back to violence because of this easy availability of these weapons. So peace and stability in the Middle East and West Africa is of course very important for Europe in general, but it can also have some very direct consequences on the internal security of Europe, and this is what I will focus on today. Let me start with some of the short-term consequences, and then I can go to the long-term consequences afterwards. When you look at short-term consequences, I think it's important to keep in mind that small arms and light weapons have been used for organizing and executing attacks on European actors and European interests in West Africa and in the Middle East. As many of you know, a lot of European soldiers have their boots on the ground in West Africa, for example. I'm thinking about Operation Barkhane, but also United Nations Stabilization Mission in Mali, for example. So we know thousands of soldiers, and especially also French soldiers, are currently in West Africa. And we know that at least 50 French soldiers have been killed since 2013 in the region, also by the use of small arms and light weapons. And these small arms and light weapons are not only aimed directly at the individuals, but for example, we've also seen in 2019 that small arms and light weapons have been used, for example, to take down a French helicopter. So attacks on European soldiers are definitely a direct short-term consequences of this direct and indirect use of small arms and light weapons by terrorist organizations and other violent non-state actors. A second short-term risk in those regions itself, I think, is the risk of kidnapping European citizens. We've seen various attempts and various successful attempts of kidnapping European citizens in the Sahel-Sahara region by Al-Qaeda affiliated groups. But also in the Middle East, we've seen that both Islamic State, but also other groups have been kidnapping foreigners, including European citizens, and have been using these small arms and light weapons to do so. So attacks on European actors and European interests within those two regions, I think, are a very immediate consequence. But what we've also seen over the years is that when these groups use these small arms and light weapons and are able to control larger territories by using these weapons, they can also use these territories, like we've seen in Iraq and Syria, to actually plan and organize attacks on European soil. We have seen that, for example, with the Paris attacks in November 2015, the Brussels attacks in 2016, but also the foiled attack on the Thalys train between Belgium and France in July 2015. All of these attacks have actually been planned and organized within northern Syria and Iraq by the Islamic State. And several of these perpetrators of these attacks actually already received military training in the region as well. So if these groups can actually use their weapons to control large territories, they can actually carry out and organize more sophisticated attacks also within Europe. Something that's very related to that is the whole issue of returning foreign fighters. As many of you know, a lot of Europeans went to fight, for example, in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, and have now returned or want to return or have been jailed. But the big risk there is that some of these people actually have more increased skills for carrying out attacks because they have combat experience, they undergone military training, had training with weapons and explosives, which means that they actually have the risk of carrying out these attacks much more easily than before, either under direction from somebody else or a specific organization, but also independent. So these are some of the very direct short-term consequences that we can see when we look at this issue of the use of small arms and light weapons for terrorist financing. But I think there's also a couple of more long-term consequences we have to take into account. And one of them is the increased risk that some of these weapons will actually be trafficked back into the EU. Already in 2015, Europol warned for this and stated that some firearms originating from the conflicts in Syria, Libya, and Mali are already available on the European black market, and that these countries may emerge as major sources of illegal firearms trafficking into the EU. And Europol not only mentioned this in 2015, but has repeated this idea that various conflict zones outside, but just outside the borders of the European Union, can actually have the potential to emerge as very important sources of firearms trafficking into the EU. And I think a lot of concern is there specifically about Libya. I think it was mentioned by both Colin as well as Méryl. Libya has really become the epicenter of arms trafficking in the wider region, with connections both to West Africa as well as to the Middle East. And there is a large fear among security experts and law enforcement officials that weapons which are now within Libya might actually be trafficked into the European Union from Libya. And this is something to take into account. What is also important to keep in mind as a long-term consequence that if this happens, if this trafficking occurs into the EU, from these post-conflict zones or conflict zones, that this actually will provide for more opportunities for terrorists within the EU as well. Let me explain that. Terrorists in the EU tend to rely on criminal connections. They need criminal connections or in order to acquire the weapons that they need to carry out their activities. But within the European Union, we tend to see this illicit gun market as a closed market with restricted access for people outside of the criminal networks and rather limited access to military-grade firearms or light weapons. And the risk here is that the potential increase in trafficking of such weapons into the EU from North Africa or the Middle East could significantly accelerate access to these weapons and lead to an increase in use and circulation of these weapons within the criminal underworld in Europe, and therefore also make it easier for terrorists with criminal connections to carry out more sophisticated attacks and more lethal attacks. And what we see here, and what we could see here, is that there is an inverse crime-terror nexus, where the small arms and light weapons which are currently being used and possessed by terrorist groups outside of Europe tend to fall into the hands of criminals who will traffic them into Europe to criminals, but from there on, they can also actually end up in the hands of European terrorists. So this, we would see a terror, crime, terror nexus. So these are some of the consequences that we foresee of this whole problematic of the use of small arms and light weapons in other parts of the world. And of course, the European Union is trying to respond to that, developed, for example, in 2018, its small arms and light weapons strategy. And in that strategy, it explicitly mentions that it wants to take actions in West Africa and in the Middle East. But when you analyze that, it's actually rather limited what they are doing and what they're stating. And it's mainly focused on supporting and strengthening regional organizations within Africa, West Africa, and the Middle East in their actions to combat the illicit proliferation of small arms and weapons. But the problem, of course, with these regional initiatives is that often they have limited impact due to the very complex reality of power struggles within the region. And those are sometimes connected to illicit or gray transfers between neighboring countries. As was also mentioned by Colin, this whole issue of state-sponsored diversion, I think, is very important to keep in mind when you're looking at what we can actually do about it. And it's very important to keep in mind that it's very difficult for the EU to actually have an actual impact on those very complex regional power struggles. But where the EU can have a direct impact, I think, is specifically on the fact that it's actually many of the EU member states are actually important producers of small arms and light weapons. And therefore, what previous research and this research has shown is that very often also European-made small arms and light weapons are being used by these terrorist organizations. Now, that doesn't mean that there are direct exports from the EU into the hands of terrorists, which we haven't found. But what happens is that very often weapons which are very durable products, which have a very long life cycle, are actually diverted after their legal exports to mainly governmental recipients. And this diversion can actually take place sometimes several decades after the initial legal export. So this is very important to keep in mind, that once these weapons are exported, it's of course very difficult to control them afterwards. Once they leave your country, they're out of your possession, they're out of your control. And they can circulate for many years and many decades between groups and even between regions. Now, both the Arms Trade Treaty and European Common Position on Arms Export Controls basically stress the importance of taking into account this risk of diversion into terrorist hands or other unwanted hands before granting export licenses. But research by Conflict Armament Research, for example, has shown that in some cases, we also see weapons which were legally exported and ended up in the hands of Islamic State within the framework of just a few months. So that means that there are also very recent cases of diversion that we need to take into account, which basically means that if the EU wants to have an impact and wants to limit the risks of these short-term and long-term consequences that I described earlier, it needs to already start strengthening its own arms export control policies for small arms and light weapons already today. And we might not be able to change the situation by tomorrow, but we need to start today to make sure that we limit these negative consequences, both for the regions themselves as well as for the EU in the long run. So with that, I would like to give the floor back to you, Tanya.
Thank you very much, Nils. We received quite a few questions. So I'm going to invite in any way all the panelists to keep their cameras on, and I have sorted out a couple of questions. I want to start with a question for Méryl. What unexpected small arms and light weapons have been found in the Sahel? So this question has been asked already quite earlier on. So Méryl, I would like to give you the floor to answer this question first. If there are any particular unusual weapons that have been found in the Sahel.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Tanya. I think in terms of the types of weapons, I don't know if there was anything very unexpected. As Colin and I described for both regions, AK pattern assault rifles were really the most common type. This is something that you can see through the attacks that these groups are carrying out in the region. But I think something that was probably less expected was the great variety in the countries and the years of productions of these arms. Even if many interviewees mentioned the fact that weapons in the region remained mainly Cold War era models, it seems that based on the data that conflict armament research shared with us, some of these weapons were produced in the 1950s and some as recently as 2017, which clearly demonstrates the ability of these groups to divert and procure weapons really soon after their production and their introduction in the region. In terms of origins, it seems to be a great variety of countries, of course, China, Russia, but also various European countries like Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, etc. So I think the years and production and countries of manufacture of these weapons was something unexpected. The models were more expected in this research in the Sahel.
Okay, thank you very much, Méryl. I see also that several of the
Tanya, could I just jump in for one second to add a quick point to what Méryl said?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Colin.
Because it's directly related to, I think, one of our preliminary research questions, and I think it's important to hone in on the fact, in the Middle East, we found that only a very small number of the AKs were manufactured post 2010. So the older age of these weapons could also, in part, explain why they're not used for direct financing. They're not necessarily viewed as attractive to buy and sell as much, whereas they could be at a more fundamental level, to engage in these kind of secondary acts of financing or indirect financing, right? Because you don't even actually have to fire the weapon for it to be used to coerce someone, to kidnap them, to extort them, etc. It just has to physically be present. So that's something to consider as well.
Thank you. So some of the participants raised the question, what are the links between the two regions? And I would like to both give Méryl and Colin a chance to reflect on that. Nils already mentioned the role of Libya, but I would ask in particular Colin to reflect on the role of Egypt, which is also a conduit in that sense. So Méryl, I first give you the floor, if you could address the links between the two regions, and then the floor to Colin in particular to focus on Egypt.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Well, I think the first thing to note is that between these two regions, we see both similarities in the procurement strategies, in the types of weapons used, but also some differences, for example, with the state-sponsored diversion being really more prevalent in the Middle East than in West Africa. When it comes to potential links, there's still little clarity on whether transfers of weapons or skill sets are taking place between parent organizations in the Middle East and their affiliates in West Africa. There have been some research that have shown that Chinese and Iraqi rifles have been found both in Syria and Iraq and in West Africa, with very close serial numbers. So that indicates that probably there are some commonalities in the supply sources, but it doesn't really prove whether there were exchanges between the groups directly. If exchanges were to take place, of course, as Tanya just said, Libya would be a key hub since it's connected to the Sahel region through the trans-Saharan trade routes and to the Middle East via the Sinai region. And probably maybe also East Africa with the maritime routes between Somalia and Yemen. Now, something that interviewees mentioned quite a lot for West Africa is that the scale of battlefield capture had been so high in recent years in the region that terrorist groups, according to many, do not really need to take the risk of establishing these supply sources, the lines and the connections so far away to get the weapons they need. But again, having a few evidence doesn't mean that it does not happen. So that is clearly something that has to be monitored carefully in the years to come.
Yeah, I would add from the perspective of Egypt that this is not necessarily new. In fact, under Sisi, there's probably been less smuggling because he's really cracked down on the Sinai crossing and has taken a hard stance vis-a-vis Hamas. But the Sinai Peninsula and Egypt more broadly has been something of a smuggler's haven for a long time. It's been a crossing point for fighters, weapons, illicit goods between Egypt and the Maghreb. So kind of, again, you have to think about the longstanding nature of a lot of these networks that are highly, not only highly durable, but highly adaptive, and they're able to kind of take advantage of opportunities that present themselves. Although I would have to imagine after the recent incident in the Suez, there might be some angry arms traffickers that are waiting on some shipments that might be a little bit delayed.
Thank you very much, Colin. And now I have a question for Nils. Nils, is there any indication that human traffickers are using the same routes to smuggle weapons into Europe from West Africa? If not, why do you think that is?
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you for that question. At the moment, there are no or almost no cases known where weapons are trafficked together with human beings from North Africa, for example, into the EU. But what is not there today might be there in the future. Let me elaborate on that. I think what we see very often is that this trafficking of arms is often connected to the smuggling of other types of products. Especially drugs are often trafficked, and then weapons are included in a package of drugs. But the main product being trafficked is actually drugs. I don't think we have seen that yet, for example, from North Africa into Europe, because at the moment, the demand for these weapons is still very high within the region itself. So if there is a very high demand right now, for example, in Libya, because of the ongoing conflict, it's very unlikely that these weapons will then flow into the opposite direction. And this is what we've seen in the last 10 years, is when there was a big conflict going on in Libya, the weapons were actually there. As soon as the conflict stabilized a little bit, the weapons started to disappear into neighboring regions, neighboring countries. So at the moment, this demand for weapons is still so high that I don't expect flows to go into Europe right now. But we hope, of course, that the situation will stabilize in North Africa. But then the unwanted result would be that there is a bigger risk that some of these weapons might flow into Europe, and then they might flow together with other drugs or human beings being trafficked into Europe. But I don't expect that human traffickers will be the main traffickers of firearms, because I think those boats with people coming over the Mediterranean are quite visible. It's very difficult to hide weapons on the ship, while it's much easier to do that together with drugs in smaller packages. So at the moment, I don't think so, and there is a small chance, but I expect more that actually the drug trafficking from North Africa into the EU will actually bring along that some of these weapons might come into Europe as well.
Thank you, Nils. I'm moving on to another question by Erika Mumford, and she's is interested to know more about the acquisition of small arms of light weapons, and if any recommendations on preventing that, what we can recommend. Obviously, in the last part of the report, we have included a section on policy recommendations. And this is indeed one of the issues we have been discussing as research team, all of us together. You know, what can you do and what can be actual tangible on both sides? So it's not only what the EU can do, but it's also what can be done in the countries. So I'm just going to mention a few and leave the floor open to my colleagues to also add in a few thoughts there. So one of the things is to strengthen indeed the arms export policy by taking more into account the diversion record of the recipient countries. This should on paper, and we hope also in practice, help that no weapons are exported that easily, which are being retransferred to countries which violate international humanitarian law and human rights law. A few of the other recommendations include is to encourage states that are manufacturing weapons to ratify the Arms Trade Treaty as well. So these are just two concrete, recommendations we had. I'm looking at Colin, if you want to add anything to this on policy recommendations, because we had quite a bit of a discussion on this when we were finalizing the paper, and as well as to Nils.
We did. So I'll give you I'll give you kind of two distinct sets of recommendations. The first will be a little bit frustrating and maybe a little bit, it might sound naive, but really, how do you stop the demand for these weapons? We have to focus on solving these conflicts. And I know that that's, diplomacy with a big D, that's above the pay grade of a lot of people that think of just about, countering transnational organized crime or looking at the crime-terror nexus, smuggling, trafficking. But if you can actually work to solve these conflicts in Yemen, in Syria, elsewhere, it's going to significantly dry up the demand for these weapons. The tail end of that is, even when the conflicts are over, I think you have to focus very clearly, after hearing what Tanya had to say on DDR, at the post-conflict situation. It's not over just because there's a peace agreement signed. We know from looking at conflicts throughout history, insurgencies, civil wars, et cetera, that there's going to be this kind of residual threat posed by small arms and light weapons. I think if you can make progress in solving some of these conflicts, you inevitably, at least in my chapter in the Middle East, you also kind of get at the issue of sectarianism, because that's what's fueling a lot of these conflicts. And so that dampens the sectarian aspect as well. And now I'll give you a bit more practical recommendation. And this is something I worked on a lot when I was at the RAND Corporation. We looked at security cooperation and building partner capacity. And I know that's not sexy. It's not going to be, on the front page of the New York Times, but it works if done properly. And the key is sustaining it. It's not just throwing a pile of money at quote unquote border security or, building defense ministries and other institutions. It's sustained over time. Areas of security cooperation and building partner capacity, again, border security, those kind of logistical functionary areas, because a lot of what we see is terrorist groups taking advantage of weak states, corruption, weak rule of law, and porous borders. So it's getting at those aspects, which are really hard to do. They take a long time. They don't show immediate results. And that's something I think in particular the EU can help out with from a funding perspective. The question becomes, can you sustain those efforts over time? And there's a lot of political and financial hurdles, I think, particularly in a post-COVID environment, when we start rebalancing budgets and looking at where to divert funds. The other aspect we're seeing in the United States is this kind of shift away from counterterrorism toward great power competition. And I think we have to be very careful to walk away wholesale from counterterrorism. Just because we've done it for 20 years and there's some fatigue doesn't mean it's not going to continue to be an issue, because I guarantee you it will be.
Thank you, Colin. Nils, do you want to add anything to this?
Yes, thank you. Maybe I can add some issues based from the arms control perspective and what you can do. I think some of the stuff I mentioned earlier in my presentation, I think the EU has to have a much more comprehensive and in-depth pre-export assessment of risks of diversion. I think that's a crucial one. And in order to do so, you also have to take into account the diversion history of some of your recipients, whether that be neighboring countries to a situation of conflict, but also sometimes countries which are far away but still have interest in the region play a role. So you need to take that into account as well if you are really serious about that, and monitor your end-use agreements, because it's not allowed to just transfer weapons from one country to another without prior consent, often of the producer or the original exporting country. Second of all, I think what we need to invest in as well is post-shipment controls. This is one of the policy conclusions that we have as well. This is where you can actually start to control some of the weapons which have been exported before. And several EU member states have been working on that issue for quite some time. I think we really need to have a more effective implementation of that. And there's a very interesting report that was published also by CIPRI just a few months ago on the different ways in which EU member states are currently already doing that and what the EU can do to do so. Which also brings me one of the issues that was raised in the Q&A was a question about what you can do about tracking and tracing weapons. And I think that's a crucial one. And in reality, much of that is already ready to do because these weapons have serial numbers and you can actually go through the registers looking for what happened to these weapons. The only problem is that we see is that this takes a lot of time, and it also involves many countries because we often have seen international transfers of these weapons. And therefore, this is often not done. This is often not considered priority. It's when something happens, you want to make sure you catch the guys who did it, but trying to find out what was the logistical chain behind that operation is often not a priority. And therefore, we miss a lot of intelligence on what's going on and what the risks are of certain diversion methods. So we already have the potential to do so. I think we just need to create the awareness and see the priority and increase the priority before doing those.
Thank you, Nils. Just a few words to add on there. Indeed, you added some insights from the arm control perspective, and I think that is also has been one of the challenges we found in doing the research. There is no one-size-fits-all solution here. We have to look at through different angles, so that includes also indeed the arms control angle, but also the crime-terror nexus. So looking at through the angle of organized crime, if we can find solutions, and as Colin also pointed out, I mean, the conflict situation, yes, it would be ideal if we will be able to solve the conflicts, but we can also invest a little bit more in transitional weapon management and making sure there's an information sharing between DDR practitioners and small arms and light weapons control bodies. So looking more at the post-conflict situations. So there are a myriad of different recommendations needed to be able to address this indirect form of financing, which we have seen in our report. I still see quite a few questions. So I see an excellent question by Jerome Meyer. He's saying, following the rise of ISIS, several Iraqi military bases were raided, and a significant number of high-quality US-made weapons and equipment were looted by the group. Are we now seeing this better quality of equipment turning up in other spheres, like in Yemen or in West Africa? So this, again, goes about these linkages between the two regions. So I don't know whether Méryl or Colin would like to respond to this, or whether you have seen anything in your research regarding this.
Is the question, I guess, if the question is asking if it's the same weaponry that that ISIS looted is ending up in other battlefields, you know, what the most high-end stuff that we're seeing in Yemen and conflict armament research confirms this is mostly being brought into the country by the Iranians and given to the Houthis, not as much to other groups they're fighting on the ground. So I think, you know, it's case specific. It depends on which conflict we're talking about, which region we're talking about. But I'll turn it over to Méryl if she has anything different on West Africa.
No, it's the same thing for West Africa. We didn't see any of these weapons apart from what I mentioned, the few batches originating from the Middle East in West Africa. There's very few evidence showing that there are transfers going on. I think part of the question also raises the issue and the attention on more sophisticated weapons. In West Africa, there have been reports of drones being used or things like that. One thing I would like to underline here maybe is that, of course, the acquisition of more advanced technologies by terrorist groups, such as drones, but also night vision goggles, for example, raises a lot of attention and a lot of concerns due to the increased firepower it would give terrorist groups with, the tactical advantage it would provide them with. But what really came out from this research and was really interesting to see is that, as Colin underlined earlier, some of these weapons do not have to be the most sophisticated to be useful. To give a very concrete example, holding an old AK-47 is more than enough for militants to be able to enter villages, extort people, kidnap them, collect taxes, or conduct any of these activities that generate funds. So I think the attention should not be taken away from these more simple or rudimentary types of weapons, because they do play a very critical role.
Thank you very much, Méryl. Another question in the Q&A that has been posted: do you believe that the easy availability of small arms and light weapons diminishes its value as a commodity itself, making it more an intimidation or a deadly tool to effectuate other activities? I think this is an open question for all of us to reflect on. Méryl, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit about what I just mentioned. I think of the value of the weapon on the market is not necessarily the most important thing for these groups. That's exactly, for example, what can be seen with converted firearms. It's not something that even need to work or to be converted to be effective. It just has to look like a weapon to be used to coerce people, to intimidate them, or to rob them, for example. So I do think that question is really, really good and really applies to at least the context in West Africa.
Yeah, I would just add that why would you give up your weapon if you could use it in all of these other areas? It doesn't make any sense, right? So for a one-off, you have, you're paid whatever the going rate is, which can be quite low in the region for an AK-47. Whereas if you have that weapon, not only can you use it to protect yourself and to fight, so offensively and defensively, but it's a source of livelihood. Owning that, as we pointed out, with all these other kind of indirect means of financing. So it's actually more valuable if you hold on to it than it is if you sell it in many cases, which is why I think we see this phenomenon.
Yeah, I think we've seen that throughout the research. I mean, the added values of having a gun is much more than just the cash value, it's actually the other way around. It's also being able to assert control over a population or over a certain territory. And in some countries, it's also very much a cultural thing of having weapons. We found that very clearly in Yemen. So I think I fully agree with Colin and Méryl. I just wanted to touch upon one more question because several participants raised it in different contexts and we didn't mention it very specifically, although in all chapters of the report we did reflect on it, is the use of modern technology. And I know it plays out a little bit different in West Africa and Middle East, and it also has a component and an impact on DDR. So maybe I first go to Méryl. If you could reflect on, the use of 3D printing and other modern technology, what you see and observed in West Africa, and then I will move on to Colin, and I can add a few words on the DDR perspective, and then give the floor to Nils as well.
Yes, thanks, Tanya. This is not really something that we see in West Africa. 3D printing is not something you would see neither in the Sahel nor in the Lake Chad Basin. Even the use of the dark web is not something that we came through very often in that research. I know there are some reports on the use of the dark web in Libya, for example, but not really in West Africa. It always come back to the same dynamic through which terrorist groups are able to acquire so much material through diversions of weapons that are already there available in the region, that they do not really need those alternative solutions. I think these new technologies are way more critical in societies like in Europe, for example, where the access to weapons is much more limited than in regions like the Sahel or West Africa more broadly.
I would add briefly that, and concur, it's pretty much the same situation in the Middle East. But if we're looking into the future and we're thinking maybe 3 to 5 years ahead, one parallel I would draw is if you look at the way that ISIS was able to set up an industrial level scale production facility to make vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices. If you have the infrastructure to make these 3D weapons, and you are looking at a situation like we did with the ISIS Caliphate, even on a smaller scale, if you've got a terrorist group that is in control of large swaths of weaponry, or just large swaths of territory rather, and has the operational space to maneuver, this could be something that we are grappling with in the foreseeable future. Hard to put a number on it in terms of how far away that could be, and I think I would argue the same for the proliferation of drones. Something I'm increasingly concerned about on the kind of 3 to 5 year time horizon, and we've already seen a lot of violent non-state actors using those as force multipliers. So certainly something to consider. And something I think that's on a lot of policymakers' minds that I speak to.
Okay, so also with respect to DDR and identifying and registering the weapons, it can pose challenges. These new technologies. What we have come across in some of the interviews we've conducted and some of the researchers, especially when we are looking at modular weapons, and they can be fitted with multiple different components with different serial numbers. It makes it difficult to map and trace the weapons. So there too, we've also come across that it can pose certain challenges. I now see 2 questions I would actually like to pose to Nils. The first question, which has been asked, is what is the relevance of the link between terrorism and organized crime, especially related to the 2014 and 2019 attacks in Europe? I just want to mention that we do also reflect on the crime-terror nexus in the report, but I give Nils the floor to answer that. And following that, maybe you could also respond to a question: what specific roles can EU countries play in supporting West African countries such as Nigeria in the illicit weapons aspect? We did touch upon it a little bit, but maybe you would want to maybe one more time add a few words on that. So those two questions are for you.
Thank you for those questions. Let me also, maybe if I can, just add one more comment to the question on the new technologies.
Yep.
And I do concur with what Colin was saying, that if you give groups like IS enough time and they have enough territory, they can actually start producing those things with 3D printing. But at the moment, we're not there yet. But the technology is moving really quickly. It's really, especially in the US, it's getting a huge boost. So every few weeks, we see improvements made to the models that they can actually print. So it is possible. But at the other hand, I think these 3D printed guns also have a bad reputation among criminals and terrorists as well, because what we cannot forget is that owning a gun and having a gun and using a gun is also about reputation. It's about showing what you can do and who you know and how important you are and how big your gun is. And therefore, a 3D printed gun is not always considered the highest level of guns to have. So it's also something to take into account when we deal with this issue. But it's very important to be vigilant about this technology because it's moving so quickly. And one of the specific issues I see there as well is if we get to see really well 3D printed plastic guns with very little metal, those types of ghost guns will be very easy to hide and to smuggle into an airplane, for example, and do a lot of damage there. So this is something to take into account as well when you talk about the 3D stuff. Now, to come back to the terror crime nexus in Europe in the last couple of years, this was of crucial importance for the carrying out of these attacks in Europe. What we have seen is that many of the perpetrators of these attacks were actually former criminals. They came from the criminal underworld. They were often not very high-level criminals. They were lower-level or mid-level criminals, often involved in drug trafficking, violent street crime, that kind of stuff. And what is interesting there is that these guys knew each other. They knew each other from the criminal underworld, and they got to know each other in places like Syria and Iraq as well, where they organized these attacks. Many of these attacks took place on European soil. And there you see this continuous nexus between networks within the criminal and the terrorist world. But what is important to keep in mind is that although many of the perpetrators were actually used to be criminals or were criminals, a lot of professional criminals prefer not to work together with terrorists in Europe as well, because chances of getting caught are much higher. The penalties for getting when you get caught are much higher. So what we have seen is that, for example, groups like IS have actually warned their followers within Europe and saying, look, make sure you don't mention the fact that you are actually a terrorist. Make sure to shave off your beard. Make sure when you try to get a gun, because those things hamper your access to guns. Make sure that you show that you are actually a guy trying to rob a bank, trying to rob a grocery store. We have much higher chances of success. So while though we see this nexus, it's not a two-way street. There's a lot of curves there that both criminals and terrorists have to go around in order to find each other. But what we do see is that when it gets easier for criminals to get their hands on automatic rifles like the AK patterns, which are, of course, the type of weapon that most of these terrorists want to use. They prefer to use an AK with lots of bullets above a normal pistol, because you can do a lot more damage with an automatic rifle than with just one pistol. When it gets easier for lower level criminals to get their hands on these types of weapons, it also gets easier for terrorists with criminal connections. And therefore, I was very careful when we say, look, we have to be very careful when we look about these acceleration of access of weapons in West Africa and Middle East, because if they are being trafficked into the EU, that's this nexus that we have seen and has been very lethal might actually be reinforced even more. And then to come back to your last question, what can the EU do specifically in West Africa? Well, they can do a lot and they can do very little at the same time. Of course, what's going on in West Africa is eventually something that needs to be solved over there. And it's not like the EU has miracle solutions to everything. What we have seen is that the EU really plays the regional card, where they, of course, work bilateral as well, but they really want to support these regional organizations in getting stronger, which I think is a good way forward. But as I mentioned during my presentation, there are so many complex power struggles going on. We cannot overestimate the influence of the EU either. So what they should do is be consistent, try to share best practices, try to show by example, try to also support these organizations when they need to in order to do the basic stuff. But the situation is so complex that we cannot do everything and expect everything from the EU.
Thank you very much. Just a little bit more on the crime-terror nexus. I mean, the crime-terror nexus, I mean, as all of you know, it's very region-specific. So the way it plays out in Europe is very different than it will be in Western Africa or in the Middle East. And I think it's therefore also really important that more research is going to be conducted in the crime-terror nexus on a regional level, so that not only there is a bigger understanding, but that there's also an ability to develop risk indicators and that you're able to recognize it more clearer. At international level, there have been some efforts made already. I mean, there's the UN Security Council 2462 and I believe 2482 as well. And the GCTF, the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, has also adopted a memorandum on the criminal justice responses to terrorism and organized crime. And this links up to, I think, the final question that I want to pose to all the panelists is, what can be done to increase the synergies and bring together arms control and CT spheres in tackling these challenges? So what can the UN do and what can the other regional and sub-regional organizations do? I already took a stab on the nexus between the crime-terror nexus, and I'll share a few words at the end, but I would like to give my panelists the opportunity to see if they have any parting thoughts on how to increase the synergies and bringing together arms control and CT spheres in tackling these challenges. Méryl, floor first to you.
Yep, thank you. I think probably the first step is to encourage interdisciplinary research projects. I think what we saw with this research is that the way the research is conducted and clustered right now may not reflect the realities on the ground. We saw that there are some linkages between arms, terrorism, crime, terrorist financing, but when you want to do the research and find experts to talk with, usually you can find arms experts, CFT experts, crime, organized crime experts, people working on the regions especially, but it's quite complicated to find people that would be able to discuss these phenomena overall and its different aspects. So I think the first step, and that would really benefit our understanding of the phenomenon, is to bring all these people together at the same table and try to reflect on the challenges and the way forward.
Thank you, Méryl. Colin?
Yeah, I mean, it may sound self-serving, but I think, and perhaps it is, I think events like this and research like we were just able to take part in helps elevate this issue and the profile, and it kind of raises the awareness of some of the issues that are taking place. Look, anytime we could move away from anecdotes and toward data collection and empirical evidence, which is, and sometimes it's just a modest improvement, moving the ball forward slightly, saying, hey, we've kind of uncovered these linkages, but showing, policymakers and funding organizations that, look, this research can have an impact. I think it becomes, somewhat self-sustaining at a certain point, that we keep building on this, right? We build on lessons learned and best practices. And you mentioned some of the multilateral fora where we have these discussions. I think, we've all kind of suffered over the past year with COVID of not being in the same place. Yeah, we've done a great job adapting and doing webinars, but there's something to that in-person networking where we're actually having, 3-4 days to brief this research, to ask the hard questions, and to leave with a product that we know is going to kind of withstand scrutiny from those that are, look, this is a surreptitious and clandestine phenomena that we're investigating, right? Particularly on the crime side, this isn't something that people want to advertise is going on. And so the more that we can kind of bring this issue into the light, I think the better served we'll all be as a global community.
Thank you very much, Colin. Nils?
Yeah, just some final comments there as well. I think when you read the texts and the documents and the policy actions within the counterterrorism world and the arms trade world, they refer to each other. So every document, legal document on arms control also mentions the risk of terrorist use of these weapons, and every recent terrorist document actually mentions the risk of those guys getting guns. So I think that's clearly there. But I agree with what Méryl was saying. There are different communities of people looking at these things, and they are very often unaware of each other's reality, let's say. And I think it's important to bring these people together internationally, but also nationally, because even if these people work within the same organization, like, for example, police in a certain country, the people doing terrorism investigations often are not aware of what's going on with the people doing arms trafficking cases. They don't talk enough to each other, even within the same organization. So I think those are breaking the silos is actually what we need to do much more often, both nationally, domestically, as internationally. And then I agree with what Colin was saying as well. Eventually, it's also about research. It's about getting the data. It's about knowing what's going on, not only about terrorist possession of guns, but also about the acquisition of the guns. And the more we can actually uncover these flows, the more political leverage we and others have to do something about it, because this is actually what is needed. And a lot of great work has been done in recent years with this report, but also with report by others. Something, for example, about the work that Conflict Armament Research has been doing for years now is really of vital importance. And it's important for other countries, for the EU and international donors to realize that and to fund those kinds of research projects, because they allow us to have more political leverage to do something about this issue and bring these communities together. So.
Thank you very much, Nils, and thank you very much, all my colleagues, for sharing their final thoughts on this. Just a few words to add there, that indeed it starts with data collection, and we have found that in particular challenging to do so in COVID times. There's limited data available online, and we've been very grateful to the many people who were willing to take the time to do interviews with us, to give us a bit better insight, and that there is not, the paper reality, but that we really get more of a sense what's happening on the ground. And I think we have to be realistic in what we are achieving and what we all can achieve in the short term. I think it are incremental, small steps that all of us can take. And I think this report also is just one step, and it doesn't solve obviously all the problems. It is illustrating that there are different fields and specialists working with also different objectives than only reducing the arms flow. So I think it's important to also get a better understanding how others operate before we can create these synergies which we are talking about. And we hope we have been able to at least raise some awareness on how terrorist organizations are funding to some extent their organizations to arms trafficking. At this point, I would very much like to thank also Conflict Armament Research, all our interviewees, and the people here at ICCT, but in particular the research team. It was a great pleasure working with all of you the last year on this report. And I very much enjoyed doing this live briefing together, and I look forward in future events together, and that we can continue our collaboration. And to the participants, of course, Very grateful that you were there and for your insightful questions. If you have any further questions on the content, please send them to info@icct.nl, and we will see how and who will respond to them. And my final request is if you would please fill in the short survey, which will pop up as soon as we are done. So on behalf of all of us at ICCT, thank you very much for joining us, and